Hello again and welcome to Spotlight, the interview show on RT. I'm Al Grinov, and today my guest here in the studio is Donnacha or Beacháin. One of the most remarkable political events of this year has been the end of the Orange rule in Ukraine. The Orange team, which came to power in Ukraine with the enthusiastic support from the West, has yielded the power to its arch-rival, Viktor Yanukovych. Is this the end of color revolution saga? To talk about the phenomenon of color revolutions, our guest today is a specialist on the issue, Irish political scientist Donnacha or Beacháin.
Donnacha Beacháin is an expert on color revolutions. He is lecturer in political science at the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University. He is also the Marie Curie Fellow researching the color revolution phenomenon in post-Soviet countries. Having lived in Georgia, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, Donnacha has experience of CIS countries and people's discontent at first hand. He has been the visiting fellow at numerous universities, lecturing in the Department of International Relations, Conflict Resolution and Political Science. Donnacha Beacháin is in our studio today to talk about the color revolutions.
Hello, Mr. Beacháin. Thank you very much for coming to the studio today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, first of all, talking about these color revolutions, are they really revolutions? Were they really revolutions? We call them revolutions, but some people say they look more like coups d'etats, not like real revolutions. What would you say?
Well, of course, it depends on your definition of a revolution. If you take the classic definition, which involves a major societal change, they would not meet the classic definitions of revolutions. In that sense, they would have more in common with coups d'etats. However,
a change of regime.
A change of regime, yes. But what was interesting, I think, about the colour revolutions was the manner in which they managed to mobilise a large amount of people quite suddenly and over a consistent period of time, often in very bad climatic conditions, and to challenge relatively unpopular governments and to succeed in bringing about change. There was a certain democratic legitimacy, of course, to many of these changes, because the parties which were representing the people on the streets had achieved quite a good degree of success.
Well, let's recall some of these revolutions which took place in the former Soviet republics during the last 10 years of their independence from the USSR. Here's this report from Spotlight's Elena Demidova.
Hundreds of thousands of Georgians took to the streets of Tbilisi in 2003. They were protesting against what they believed were rigged elections. It was a religious holiday at the time, so many people were holding flowers. That's why the protests later became known as the Rose Revolution. It led to the replacement of Eduard Shevardnadze in a new round of elections by Mikhail Saakashvili. The following year, things went along similar lines in Ukraine. The Orange Revolution there is thought to have been partly inspired by the Georgian Rose Revolution. Viktor Yanukovych was initially declared the winner in the second round of the presidential election. However, many Ukrainians thought the ballot had been rigged. Huge protests led to a new election, after which the opposition leader Viktor Yushchenko was declared the winner. Orange was the color adopted by Yushchenko's camp for his election campaign, and it gave name to the revolution. The 2005 Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan initially followed the same pattern as its predecessors in Georgia and Ukraine, but was eventually marked by more violence. Opponents of the color revolutions tend to see them as something supported and even planned by the West, and particularly the United States. Meanwhile, the effect of the color revolutions may not be lasting, as was the case with Ukraine. The Orange leader, Viktor Yushchenko, saw his support plummet by the end of his presidency, to be replaced by the man he defeated 6 years ago. However, in Georgia, despite criticism and anti-government demonstrations, Mikhail Saakashvili managed to be re-elected in a hard-fought election early in 2008.
So a good question here put by our reporter is most of the people living in this country would think that a color revolution is something masterminded in Washington, D.C., especially to change the pro-Moscow regime in one of the former Soviet republics. Is it a definition okay? for you?
I think there's an overemphasis on the foreign factor. I mean, myself and Abul Polesi, who have a book coming out on this topic of colour revolutions, identified 5 variables, essentially. One of which was the character of the regime itself. The second was how strong the opposition was. The third was the external factors, whether they be America or Russia or the European Union. Fourth, civil society. The fifth being the people themselves and what motivates them to mobilize. In terms of the external factor, to be honest, I think it would be to overestimate the efficiency and professionalism of Western policymakers to say that they could orchestrate over such a large territory a series of events like the colour revolutions. It would be to underestimate the domestic factors and to rob the people of agency who were involved in the colour revolutions. What you had, I think, was an echo effect where at the time, 2004, 2005, America was struggling in Iraq. It was looking for some democratic success stories. They laid claim, essentially, to the colour revolution phenomenon, and that was picked up then by the Kremlin, who listened to that and said, well, if they're claiming it, it must be so. NGOs as well, who are working in the region, who have to justify their actions to their donors, also laid claim. I lived in Georgia between 2000 to 2002. I was observing the elections in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. I have to say that the foreign factor was very little. And it's important to stress that the regimes that were overthrown, Shevardnadze in Georgia, Akayev, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, were very pro-Western already and were recognized as such. In 2003, Shevardnadze had signed Georgia up to be part of this coalition of the willing to fight in Iraq. In 2002, he said he wanted Georgia to be knocking on NATO's door by 2005. So, and the amount of money that was pumped into Georgia, over $1 billion in 10 years under Shevardnadze, shouldn't be forgotten about either.
But I do remember how it unfolded, I mean, the events, especially in Ukraine. And by saying that that the revolution wasn't, let's talk about Orange Revolution, it wasn't organized and masterminded totally in Washington, doesn't mean they didn't help. And doesn't mean that the Western support, including logistical support, money, media, and so on, we can't say that it wasn't a major factor. I think it was one of the major factors of the success, yes?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree with that.
What were other factors for the success of these coloured revolutions?
Well,
Western support, what else?
Yeah, the character of the regime. Was it a relatively liberal state? Did it allow opposition to mobilize, for example? Was there relative freedom of the press? For example, if you looked at Georgia, there was a very strong opposition channel, Rustaviori, which was able to beam opposition message to the people and even advertise in advance when protests were going to take place. The same, you had Canal 5 in Ukraine. And the reason why these regimes allow opposition to exist is varied, of course. I mean, it may not spring from a genuine desire to be democratic or liberal. Sometimes regimes just simply need foreign aid. For example, if you're Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, you have natural resources which you can insulate yourself from any need for foreign aid or foreign assistance. Georgia certainly couldn't do that. Ukraine couldn't do that. Kyrgyzstan was very dependent on foreign aid. So the character of the regime, the character of the opposition, are they united, for example? If you have a very disunited opposition, the people don't know where to focus their efforts. The external forces don't know where to channel funds. You need to have a united opposition.
You say that the character of the regime, a liberal regime and the existence of opposition and free press in a liberal country is one of the factors for a successful revolution in that country. Does it mean that any liberal regime is doomed?
Well, no. It's a combination of things, a synergy of forces. For example, in Georgia's case, it was liberal, but it was liberal because the state was weak. They often said that Shevardnadze essentially presided over a regime that was a democracy without democrats. Essentially, the regime wasn't democratic, but because they had privatized the state out to so many individuals. I mean, when I was living in Tbilisi, there was 4 hours of electricity every day. I mean, the police were corrupt, the educational institutions were corrupt. Essentially, the state didn't exist. So it was very easy in that situation to do what you wanted. And that's kind of liberalism, but it's not classic liberalism.
Fine. Now, what would you say? Why did these colour revolutions fail elsewhere after 2005 it was, yes? What's the reason?
The character of the other states was fundamentally different in many respects. There was a demonstration effect not just for potential opposition and protesters, but also for regimes. Regimes learnt from what had happened, and they began to take steps to insulate themselves from the colour revolution virus as they saw it spreading to their country. So, for example, you begin to see tightening up of laws in NGOs, for example, that it's more difficult for NGOs to exist, and they examine more closely the sources of their money and what kind of activities they're involved in. You also see, for example, the monitoring of youth movements, which played a part, for example, in Georgia and Ukraine, Pora, for example, in Ukraine, Kelkel in Kyrgyzstan. So you begin to see kind of pro-state youth movements emerging. And election monitors. One of the things that many post-Soviet states have been critical of was the OSCE for delegitimizing the elections, for saying that they were not free and fair. So what you find is the Commonwealth of Independent States election monitors, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they start sending monitors more or less saying the elections are fine. So essentially there's now a difference of opinion on the elections, delegitimizing the whole debate about regime change, perhaps. Also, you see, I suppose, an element of cooperation between authoritarian regimes throughout the period after the colour revolutions in Ukraine. So you see greater collaboration to prevent, we'll say, people from Ukraine visiting Kazakhstan and training people in colour revolution techniques. That's also an important factor.
Says Donnacha Beacháin, expert on colour revolutions. Spotlight will be back shortly. We will continue this interview in less than a minute, so stay with us. Don't go.
Esta es la gente que desapareció, que nos consta, que sabemos que estuvo acá y que desde acá salió a la muerte, salieron muertos.
Arrests, vanishing people, intricate tortures, killings, massive operation for exterminating dissidents. People who survived brutality of South American regimes and the CIA want justice.
Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Bolivia, Brazil, later Ecuador and Peru joined on Operation Condor.
Que nunca supimos el nombre, nunca llegamos a escuchar el nombre, solamente el llanto y los gemidos y la perilla de sangre que uno ve en el piso.
Questions unanswered, truth not found. Investigating Operation Condor on RT. Every month we give you the future. We help you understand how we'll get there and what tomorrow will bring. The best in science and technology from across Russia and around the world. Join us for Technology Update on RT.
Welcome back to Spotlight. I'm Al Grinov, and just a reminder that my guest in the studio today is Donnacha Beacháin. He's an expert from Ireland, specialist in colour revolutions. We're talking about what was going on, what's going on, and probably what was going to happen in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and some other places where on the post-Soviet space where successful colour revolutions happened. By the way, the Orange regime that came to power after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine failed this year. Last year, there was a great 2 years ago, rather, there was a great fuss in Europe and all around the world about the war between Georgia and Russia over South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So, and there is an opinion that the aggressive character of the Rose, if we can call that, a regime of Saakashvili, really disillusioned many of those in the West who really supported the colour revolution. And that was the beginning of the end of the coloured era. And because of what Saakashvili did with his support, Actually, the Orange had no support during the recent elections, and this is why they failed. Well, a long question which sounds rather like a statement. Do you agree?
I agree with some parts of it. Certainly there has been a weakening of support for the government in Georgia. I think it's partially due to a difference in expectations. I mean, there was an expectation on the part of many Western powers that the government in Georgia was going to democratize rapidly. And it's quite clear now that the Saakashvili government essentially were prioritizing state building, not democratization. So, and there were various formats that I mentioned to you, for example, that when I was living in Georgia during the last years of Shevardnadze, very little aspects of the state were working. Rapid improvements were made during the last 5 or 6 years, but they were primarily in providing state services. Part of that, of course, controversially, was building up a military. That was also part of building up a state. Controversially, I'm not sure it would be a popular view among the Georgian government or the government here in Russia, but you might say that there was a certain comparison there between what Putin did in Russia from 2000 onwards, that essentially he prioritized building the state, marginalizing the oligarchs, essentially making sure the state became powerful, sorting out territorial integrity issues like Chechnya, of course, which essentially Saakashvili would have looked at the same about Abkhazia and South Ossetia. But democracy didn't feature really largely in that, and that's why many Western powers were largely disillusioned, and you find that their statements of support for Saakashvili lessened greatly in the last couple of years. I don't think there was very much of a knock-on effect for Ukraine. I think when you say, your report there talked about the end of Orange rule, I mean, the Orange Revolution, I think, if it was about anything, was about the right of Ukrainians to choose their own form of government. And the victory for Yanukovych, in many respects, is a victory for that. I mean, the ability of the Ukrainians to choose their own president is essentially, I think, in essence, what the Orange Revolution was about. So I wouldn't be as pessimistic in that respect.
Well, let's have a look now at what people in the streets of Moscow think about color revolutions. Spotlight's Katya Illarionova has the details. She conducted the poll.
Hi, Al. Let's try to find out if people consider color revolutions to be the result of public discontent or whether they believe Western political strategies have something to do with it.
Colour revolutions are a combination of people's anger and Secret Service technologies which use them to their advantage.
I think Western political strategists do their business using people's anger.
No political strategist can do anything if there's no popular anger, which is a very useful tool for different manipulations. It's all interconnected.
Of course, and the majority of people say this, that it's the result of American propaganda. You ask me why? To weaken our country, to make a puppet out of the country where revolution takes place.
There are many factors that contribute to colour revolutions, but people's anger is not so important. I believe money and political will are to blame.
Al, I've got Benedict here. He's got a question for our guest.
Is there a chance a color revolution can happen again in former Soviet republics?
What would you say?
The simple answer would be yes, provided the conditions are there. I think it's less likely than it was during that, you might say, high point of the colour revolution phenomenon between 2003 and 2005. But of course, if any number of those combination of factors come together, a certain type of regime, opposition, external factors, civil society and ordinary people, of course it's possible.
Well, people here, people that we heard right now in this report, they mentioned two things: the anger of the people and also Western technologies. Well, we have discussed the Western technologies. Now, speaking about the anger, do you think that the level of that anger, the level of, let's call it, discontent of the masses was enough to really overthrow the existing regime? And was it discontent with actually the government that they had at that point, or with the Soviet past? Was it like you know, an aftermath of liberation from the Soviet Union, so the people wanted further distancing from Moscow, from Russia, from whatever reminded them of their past?
It was a combination of both. I mean, obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the impoverishment of a lot of people, and that was always in the background. If you take Georgia, for example, increasingly Shevardnadze's unpopularity was linked to the fact that he was also, of course, a key Soviet figure, and there was a desire for a break. But the elections are important as a catalyst, I think, because, you know, people could endure lots of things, but they were waiting for the opportunity to give a verdict on the government. And when the government then decided to falsify the elections, it was a collective slap on the face. It was saying there is no way now that we can legitimately or constitutionally remove a government. And that's why elections became the focal point of the colour revolutions. Of course, there was underlying disenchantment by a large amount of people, but the elections were the key catalyst, the trigger, which allowed people to mobilise. And I think, as I said, it's because of the fact that elections came to signify the right to express a verdict.
If we look from Moscow today, I'm looking from Moscow, I haven't been to Kyiv or to Tbilisi for a pretty long time, at what Yushchenko has done during his presidency in Ukraine, what Saakashvili has done and still is doing in his presidency in Georgia, I don't think their faces will appear on Georgian coins in the future. So, do you think they care, these two guys? Or they more care about well, earning enough money and to secure themselves nice and comfortable life after they quit the posts?
Well, I'd have to be a drinking partner of either Yushchenko or Saakashvili to know their inner motivations. However, I mean, I think it's fair enough to say that they contributed to, certainly in Ukraine, there's a contribution that Yushchenko made to essentially handing over power to his opponent. That's an achievement in itself, because in so many post-Soviet countries, the fault line is essentially those that allow the opposition to win and those who don't. And to me, the achievement of Ukraine is that you have this pendulum of power going between opposition and government in what is a deeply divided society on many fundamental issues. In Georgia, of course, the real test will come for the next presidential election. What is President Saakashvili's exit strategy once his second term of office is finished? But there have been some solid achievements, undoubtedly, and in the democratic aspects.
Speaking about manipulations, and the people in the streets of Moscow talked about manipulating the public opinion, what was the role of press, internal press, NGO-controlled press, and international press in conducting those revolutions?
The role of?
Press, media.
The media, internally or externally?
Both.
Both. Well, I think in terms of internally, again, the existence of a relatively free media did contribute to popularizing opposition caricatures of the government and essentially trying to portray them as essentially a government that was on the verge of collapse and stoking up discontent against the government. Internationally, it was more about delegitimizing the elections and essentially that in turn influenced Western governments to say, look, this will have diplomatic repercussions if essentially something isn't done to modify the electoral results or have a rerun of the election. So the media was important. It was part of a cocktail essentially of factors. On its own, it wouldn't have been enough.
When today you are looking back at the media coverage, Western media coverage of the events, would you agree with me that media was very much biased, Western media?
In covering the cover illusions?
In the case of Georgia, Ukraine.
Yeah, I think there was a certain kind of euphoria that this was a democratic success story, and of course, I guess the readership generally like a simple story. I mean, it's like marriage in a Hollywood movie. I mean, very few people scrutinize what happens afterwards, and so yeah, I think that there was a certain uncritical acceptance that this was a good thing, and in a way, they turned away then from Georgia and Ukraine after the colour revolutions took place, and that in retrospect probably was a mistake. But to go back to something you said earlier as well about coins and their legacy, their face on the coin, again I think it's a positive thing that there won't be the faces of Yushchenko and Saakashvili on the coins. I think if you look again at regimes in, for example, Central Asia, where I've lived for many years, there's an attempt to establish quite strong personality cults, and that's something that wasn't done in Ukraine or Georgia to any great extent, and therefore I think it's a positive thing because there is a temptation if you get to power for long periods of office to try and create some kind of personality cult.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And just a reminder that my guest in the studio today was Donnacha Beacháin, expert on colour revolution. And that's it for now from all of us here. If you want to have your sales spotlight, just drop me a line. We'll be back with more first-hand comments on what's going on in and outside Russia. Until then, stay on RT and take care. Thank you.